We shall begin recording now. Connecting to the server. All right. So thank you guys for coming today. I really appreciate it. So in lieu of the residency that we were hoping to do this year on board the ONCA barge, we set up this panel series because of lockdown and quarantine. It's difficult for us to, bring artists to us, but we can always just sit around and have a conversation. Um, so I'm going to preface this by just saying a little bit about what the panel is. And I kind of came to you asking if you'd like to participate in what I was calling an anti-racist cultural leadership panel series. And there was like a really important impetus for me here. As you guys both know, the BLM movement started in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman um, after he murdered Trayvon Martin. But this last year, after the murder of George Floyd, it got international mainstream news attention. And from all these different organizations like art galleries and university across the world, people were posting like BLM anti-racist sentiments. Yet there's little kind of evidence of them actually having any kind of stake or practice that's really rooted in anti-racism. There's no framework of like kind of disseminating like where racism comes from in a cultural and educational sectors, and also even a way to like justify why, like especially in the UK, like the majority of universities have white faculty only, or black and brown faculty like me, who is like a doctoral tutor on precarious contract. So I think that what I was seeing was a lot of like opportunities that seemed very like gatekeepy and like white savior esque, where they were offering like unsustainable like grant and money and opportunities that aren't fully like compensated the way they should be to emerging artists, and not like kind of acknowledging the cultural leadership that already exists from anti-racist activists and artists and educators. So I just wanted to focus this panel to hear from these artists and educators and organizers, and especially people and artists like you guys who kind of do all three at the same time, like your activists, your artists, your educators. And I think that like understanding your interdisciplinary practice also like can help us to understand how to like be anti-racist as well, because I feel like this is a multifaceted approach. um, so firstly, I'm going to introduce Mattie Loyce. And Mattie, I have your bio up here. Mattie Loyce is an interdisciplinary arts curator, creative producer, and community organizer originally from and currently based in San Francisco, California. Mattie focuses her work on engaging socio-political content and community building across disciplines and geographies. Throughout her career, she has made a commitment to amplifying the voices and supporting the lives of people with marginalized identities, specifically people and artists of the African diaspora, queer people, and people of color. Mattie has worked across the United States, Brazil, the Caribbean, and United Kingdom, collaborating and producing community-based projects and artworks. So thank you for joining us, Mattie, and I look forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you for having me. So should I get going on
Yeah,
that?
whatever.
That
Yeah,
note?
on that note.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess that's an overall bio about me. Um, let's see where I might want to begin. So I guess when I was doing my note, and thank you, Nadia, for kind of introducing and kind of welcoming this conversation and bringing this opportunity for, for people, period, to have a kind of another intentional space to explore this work. And it's always nice, especially as, we all were catching up in the beginning. If we haven't met before, it's nice to meet now, you know. Um, and in times like this is what happens, right? And it happens through people organizing these moments for us together. So I guess when I was preparing my notes, one thing I wanted to kind of ground the beginning of my kind of discussion around my work was with one definition of anti-racism that I thought was helpful. I've recently been doing some writing also for a PhD application I've been approached about working on. So, and it's in relationship to museums. Well, I'm creating a new framework and I'm thinking about talking about decolonial museology and what that might look like, and if it right, and if it could be right, and and also if anyone's on mute, I'm cool for it to not be on mute if we want to do snaps in the middle, because
Okay.
that's we can be anti-racist in that praxis and that we don't have to like withhold ourselves to silence as so I'm up for the snaps and claps anyways. Yeah, so I'm gonna share this definition of anti-racism to begin, and then move from there to set a framework for what I'm going to talk about my practice with. So this is from yeah, so this is from the Civil Liberties Research Center. This is kind of their working definition on their website. And it goes, anti-racism is understood as the active process of eliminating racism by changing structures, systems, policies, and social attitudes in order to redistribute power equitably. And I thought that was just a really nice, for lack of better words, a really nice way to talk about anti-racism and describe it because we're discussing, and it's a nice way to frame it. Let's start. And what I like about this framing is talking about, sorry, I'm fumbling at the moment. But what I like about this is thanks, thanks family. Right. But what I like about this is talking about the redistribution of power equitably. I really like that ending note there. And thinking about how we're changing structures, we're changing systems, policies, and social attitudes towards that redistribution of power. And having that be our praxis. And so, yeah, so I guess, so from there, that's the working definition, that's the framework from which I'll start to talk about my work. So as it was talked about, or as you shared in my, written bio, I've worked, I'm halfway reading from notes and halfway I'll go off the cuff, but I've worked at the crux of kind of social services and cultural activism predominantly being in fine arts and exhibitions work for the last 12 years. But also fine arts and exhibitions work specifically in my work through the lens of community engagement. And doing, I would say my most recent job within the fine arts sector specifically was I was the curator and artistic program manager and curator at a place called 198 Contemporary Arts and Learning in London for 2 years, which is a historically Black arts gallery, started in 1988. Also funny, Arnold, because my other family gallery in San Francisco was started in 1988, the luggage store. And again, I would say these spaces, I'll note both of those spaces, but were built as art spaces for community and by community. And another thing that I will also note about by and for community art spaces, for me, especially when they're started by people of color, are inherently anti-racist, and they're also inherently multi-purpose, is what I'll say. And the reason for that, and for me, the reason for that being is that marginalized people and people of color or people of marginalized identities on whatever kind of intersection that you're living with that within, historically have to use, have to use what they have to do many things with it. Right. And again, because we are in a space of, against kind of greater hegemony or greater power structures, we're in a space that we don't have said certain powers that be. So we have to naturally redistribute that power equitably amidst ourselves when we're not receiving, the structural power, the structural things that we might hope for from other spaces. And so One Innate was built out of that, built out of that trajectory and built out of that praxis and need by community. Now functions as a fine art space, but also, has a great community arts, a great community program, has had a youth program for a number of years, and also started as it, was started by the people of Brixton, and not fine art people, specifically that. It was started as a Black community space in Brixton during, shortly after the Brixton riots, which were race riots in Brixton. Brixton, if anyone is listening to this conversation and doesn't know kind of the history, is a historically Black neighborhood in London, in South London, and historically mixed, but also historically Black. And so what One Innate kind of grew out of this need by the community for a space to hold themselves. And then as it happens, many, in many spaces, someone came in and was like, hey, I'm an artist. Can I show my stuff here? Because no one else will show my stuff because of this or because of this or, whatever it may be, or because of whatever it may be. And so, yes, of course, the answer was yes. And then it slowly became it slowly started to become more of an art space, or more fine arts oriented over the years. Now it's been 30 years. They celebrated 30 years in 2018. And yeah, so after that tangent, I guess going back to like kind of the inspiration and the necessity of anti-racism within my work, I would say, comes from my personal kind of like and spiritual need to do this work for ourselves, for the before and the beyond is what I like to talk about. Because I do this work for what became before me, and to honor what came before me. And I'm only here because of, I'm here much in part because of what came before me. And I want to honor that. And I also want to honor what is beyond me. And so that is part of my commitment to anti-racist work. And yeah, so again, I was writing some notes, and I was writing some around kind of this topic and just reflecting more so. I'm not talking specifically about a project that I'm doing at the moment, but I'll talk about like many different projects or different tangential experiences and longitudinal experiences I've had in my work. But one thing I think is interesting about, let's say, the work that I've been doing over the last decade, and it's fluxed between doing direct social services work, there's been like a pendulum swing, let's say. There was a period of time where I was a more full-time community mental health worker, and providing therapy to children and families, and kind of family advocacy work. And then on the other side of the hour, I was also running my own pop-up art gallery and running exhibitions for people of color, or artists of color, that is. But one thing I was writing a note on and I want to tap on here is that I think when you're doing any form of community-based artwork, I also feel it is a social service for me. Because I think naturally we think about social services and we think about, okay, is it medical oriented? Is it about, caring for the elderly? Is it about all the, X, Y, and Z? But when you're doing community building work, that is a social service, and also I think, in its most kind of literal terms, when you're looking at those two words put together, why do we not include the arts in that? And I also think that when we're thinking about, I'm kind of tying some thoughts together as I'm speaking, but when we're thinking about kind of anti-racism and the history of racism and what it's done to communities of color, it's historically put us in boxes that we did not ask for, that we did not define, and structures that don't inherently empower or support us and support our liberation, and support our thrival instead of survival. And they don't, right. And they don't always want us to survive, period, but they surely don't want us to thrive.
Yeah.
And so, what I would say in regards to that is when we're doing arts practice, and we're doing community-oriented arts work. And I feel like all artwork should be community-oriented, period. And I also think oftentimes when you come from a marginalized identity, and I continue to say marginalized identity because I want to be inclusive of the many different intersections of it, that identities that we can have. So when you come from a marginal, base, I am a multicultural Black woman, but I'm also a queer Black woman. I'm also a queer multicultural Black woman, and these things, change along. And also our identities have capacity to change over time, but oftentimes our race doesn't, and so separate.
Just so you know, we did go over time. I forgot to give 2 minutes because I got engrossed.
Oh, oof. Okay.
But you can
Well,
finish
look
your
at me. I
thought,
was like,
Bert.
Nadia, I'm not gonna have enough for 10 minutes. And then just
Usually how it goes, right?
yeah. Okay. Well, let's see if there's one last little nugget that I wanted to share. Yeah, I think we can talk about it in the conversation, but that's where I am. Hopefully that was helpful, share, and I'm really happy to be here in this conversation, and meeting new family members and old family members at the same time. And yeah, and
well, I want to say thank you for sharing your light. It's a light you have. It's this thing we're talking about, family and connecting. It's important to some of the questions that I do want to ask about the importance of community and not working in isolation, maybe being part of an organization with a mission about anti-racism. I kind of want to get to that and ask you some questions, but there were so many things that I saw echoing between what I'd like to present and what you just said that maybe I should just jump into my presentation. It's going to be, I'm going to read something that I wrote recently, and I just heard so many wonderful reverberations between some things I'm going to talk about, some experiential things that I think will help explain to some people some of the things that you talked about, which might sound more theoretical in some ways, although they might not be. But I also want to say, really great to meet you. Really great to meet you. And thank you, Nadia, for inviting me, oh, Nadia probably wanted to introduce me and I just jumped in, didn't I?
I mean, it's okay, Arnold. I can post-introduce you too, if you like.
Oh, go ahead. You can introduce us.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay. So Arnold, I've known for quite some time. He was my mentor in grad school. Just want to say that right off the bat before I do the proper bio. Arnold taught me so much about art and about education and about like just how to learn and live and make work and like actually have some confidence in myself at a time where I think that I needed to find that.
Can I interrupt you a little bit? Sorry. Because it was something that Mattie said that really brought me back to those days when I was your mentor in school. And one of the things that I really heard echoed in Mattie's presentation is what I've always said is don't wait for some curator to give you a show.
Yeah.
Take it into your own hands. Without the artists, there would be no curators, no installers, no marketing people, no fundraising people. And so to say that is to move the power back to us. And I really heard, I really got excited when Mattie said the word power. That is what, oh, John's here.
John's here.
Hey, John.
But when Mattie said power, I'm like, that is what, we could talk about a lot. But anyway, I'm sorry, Nadia.
No, please don't be sorry. Arnold, Mattie, this is John Smith. Hi, John.
It only happens in my world.
What a
Um,
nice entrance.
This is some COINTELPRO kind of stuff.
They're not trying to have this happen,
no,
but it's happening.
it's happening. Why are they doing this? Oh my gosh, John, you missed Maddie's wonderful talk, but we're going to come back to it. And I'm going to just introduce Arnold, and he's going to talk a little bit, and then I'm going to introduce you, my friend,
Okay.
in a proper way, in a very proper way.
And I'll stop interrupting.
I do love your interruptions, though. So Arnold J. Kemp is an artist and educator based in Chicago who has been concerned with artists, writers, curators, and educators working in spaces founded by artists for artists. He has published writing internationally, most recently in Text der Kunst, Spike Art Magazine, and October. His work is in the collections of the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Portland Art Museum, and the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, among others. He is also currently preparing for 3 solo exhibitions. How he does it, I don't know. At the nonprofit space Joan in Los Angeles, at the Jan Schrem and Maria Manetti Schrem Museum of Art at University of California, Davis, and at 1430 Contemporary Portland, Oregon. He is a 2012 John Simon Guggenheim Fellow, and until recently was the Dean of Graduate Studies at the School of Art Institute of Chicago. All right.
Okay. So now I have to perform my little thing. I'm just going to read something. I was contacted recently by a very academic journal who reached out to me and others with a basic prompt saying they'd like us to write 1,000 words on what the term decolonize means to us, what it means in our practice. And so here was my response. The situation of art now, reflecting the current sense of post-colonial crisis, demands thinking about the neo-colonial in connection with notions of cultural difference, where every notion of difference refers back to colonial fascination with a primitive other carrying a fixed ethnic identity, the product of a larger conceptual entanglement coexisting with concerns of anti-racism and respect for traditional land rights. Decolonization is more than just a rethinking of our relationship to images and objects. In my work in art and scholarship, the term decolonize has a bearing on image and object making and the histories and places in culture in which critical artwork circulates. Much like Kerry James Marshall, I don't want to be vague about the dialogues and conversations with history that my work seeks to have. In 1993, David Hammond said to me that he didn't care whether people understood his work and that he would even prefer if people thought that his work was from outer space. Perhaps this was because outer space would be a pre-colonized place, where Hammonds could set the terms for the consideration of his achievement. I said to Hammonds that he sounded like Sun Ra, the legendary jazz musician who claimed to be from Saturn. Hammonds replied, exactly. Whether it is outer space or outer consciousness, the locus of artistic activity must not be colonized if critical artists mean to go someplace where others have not. In 1998, during a studio visit with members of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art's Society for the Encouragement of Contemporary Art, they call it SECA, one of the SECA members said to me in frustration, all of the Black artists that we have visited make work about slavery. So my question is, why don't you? My answer was that since she already knew this about Black people, I didn't need to make work that illustrated this fact. I didn't need to make work that didn't trouble essentialist assumptions about my race and that didn't refuse to perform what she would recognize as art and as Black. Throughout my work, these refusals have been non-negotiable. I find that in the art world, the colonized consciousness is one that has to negotiate. For this reason, my work has existed outside of the art market and has made its way by being successfully exhibited and critically received in an apartment, in a closet, and in an empty car garage, and in an almost derelict building in Mexico City. My desire to not negotiate the terms of my colonization, to show my work in spaces started by artists for artists, has paradoxically not prevented my work from being collected by institutions such as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Berkeley Art Museum, the Studio Museum in Harlem, and the Portland Art Museum. It is in fact important that my work is shown in museums which participate in the colonizing activity of building public collections, while I continue to operate in a mindset of a decolonized participant in artistic community building. This is important. In 2003, I met the Vancouver-based artist Raymond Boisjoli as the result of being on the jury for a biannual prize awarded to emerging artists by the University of Washington's Henry Art Gallery. During the jury's visit with Boisjoli, I found his ambition to undo some of the structures that process his work through the filter of Indigenous art, echoing my own concerns with my work being read through a lens shaped by centuries of white supremacy and xenophobia. At the end of the visit, I was not sure if I would ever hear from Boisjoli again, and then in 2014, he took up a 6-week residency at the Banff Center for Art and Creativity in the thematic program In-Kind Negotiations. As the lead faculty of the residency, Boisjoli designed the program and invited me and Joar Nango, an architect based in Norway, to share leadership duties. Together, we welcomed 10 international artists of different Indigenous identities to work through Boisjoli's notion that there is no particular way things are supposed to have been, an open-ended framework to discuss post-colonialism. Much of the discourse revolved around undeclared or partially declared intentions, a method of not saying directly. Boisjoli's message was aspirational in framing a parallel reality where things might have gone differently. His inviting me, a Black artist of Caribbean heritage, and Nango of the indigenous people from Sapmi, the traditional territories of Sami, seemed at once poetic and pointedly political. The gesture of invitation was suggestive of shared alliances and strategies for survival. As Banff is located on the lands of Treaty 7 territory, where the creation of Canada's first national park imposed boundaries and displaced the territory's original stewards, the people of the Stoney Nakoda, Blackfoot, and Tsuut'ina nations, it seemed most culturally appropriate that I would only attend at the invitation of people related to the land. My participation ensured that the residency would make space for the participants to locate themselves within a post-identity spectrum of engagement that lay somewhere between the Indigenous and the global. At Banff, I noted that colonization allowed for a false separation between people with shared interests. So I gave lectures, led seminars, and organized social activities that exposed the residents to ways of being in the world and in the studio that made room for thinking critically about issues of identity, indigeneity, and colonization embedded in the educational, artistic, and cultural structures around us. While acknowledging the role of artists in reflecting on social and political changes necessary for the expansion of art today, I was sensitive to the group's desires to dismantle traditional divisions established between design, architecture, and visual art. I gave the group permission to intertwine each discipline with methods and processes led by improvisation. I brought other role models such as Adrian Piper, Kathy Acker, Alice Coltrane, Ornette Coleman, and Robert Ferris Thompson to the group. We took advantage of chance experimentation with localized raw materials and punk and free jazz aesthetics, and we tuned our relationship to place. Our actions and interventions at Banff ultimately added up to new knowledge, and connectedness to the environment in which we stood. On that land, decolonization was an urgent relational practice of self-affirming, space opening, and permission-giving embodiments rooted in culture and tradition that countered ongoing legacies of colonial violence and imposition of oppressive structures. Thanks.
Oh my gosh,
Thanks for
that was
listening,
so
everyone.
Very
Yes.
impressive, very impressive.
Thank you.
Oh man, Arnold, thank you for sharing that. Should we do we'll do John and then do questions talks? I've got all my notes written questions, but I want
Lots
to
of resonating feelings there, Arnold.
Yeah.
Exactly that.
You know, the things you were saying about, you know, working together, a community, shifting of power. I think even thinking about, you know, multiracial, multi-identity issues that you mentioned, I think that are in that little essay of mine. It really was affirming to hear your presentation, that's all.
Oh,
I'm glad. And likewise. And one thing that I'm gonna drop it so I don't forget it, but locating self is a note that I wrote right before, or amidst this, but before I think I started to share my presentation, and I want to talk about that because you just you said that towards the end of your piece, but about locating ourselves, not only an identity with, you know, not only in kind of orientation to the work, but physically on the land, you know, locating self, let's say in our presentation and where our work is shown, you know, the different kinds of locating self and how that works through structures of decoloniality or not, you know, works through lots of things. So I'm not going to go on, but I want to throw that in there so we can maybe talk about it later as a group.
I like that.
I can also send that little essay to everyone if you want to read it.
I would really love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely, definitely.
So I'll introduce you guys to John, who joined us a little bit late. John is you're in Atlanta right now, right, John?
Yeah.
And you didn't send me a proper bio yet, but I could talk a little bit about what I know about John. I met John in Germany. He was visiting at Humboldt University, screening a film about the invaders, which was how would you describe the invaders, John?
Just a Black Power organization that began in the 1968. We were, or a group that was not tied to any of the larger organizations. We started just basically on our desire to make change in our community. And from that effort, we grew because of the Memphis sanitation strikes and Dr. King coming to town and his assassination. We grew to uh, a place of relevance in Memphis, but outside of Memphis, we were virtually unknown. So this was in 1968, and in 2012, two young kids then these were white kids. I call them kids because they were in their 20s. And one was named Richard Smith. He had just finished school, film school, and the other was J.D. Harrell. They were totally, they didn't know anything about the invaders. They'd never heard of the invaders. And that was what got them into the story, because their question was, how can we grow up in Memphis and not know anything about the group, because Charles Cabbage, who was one of the guys that helped organize the invaders, and myself, we were the last two people to talk with Dr. Martin Luther King about 45 minutes before he was assassinated. And in that conversation, Dr. King was recruiting us to join his Poor People's Campaign because all of the civil rights leaders, the known civil rights leaders, were not supporting his Poor People's Campaign. So he was like in a place where he could not go forward. And when he came to Memphis and he saw what we did in terms of turning out people for the sanitation march that ended in the riot, he was impressed that local guys could turn out that many people. It was about 50,000 people that showed up for that march. Now, Dr. King's largest march, not counting the 1963 March on Washington, which was a march that the Union produced the people. They bussed in people from all over the country. And he was impressed with the fact that we were able to get that many people out of the Memphis area to show up for a march for the poor. And he wanted us to join his campaign and recruit other Black Power organizations to help him. And if we could do that, then he had started out originally talking about taking 1 million people to Washington, D.C. And that's a mammoth job if you think about it, because they were going to march people, and he was relying on preachers and other civil rights leaders to help him. And he saw in that march how he could eliminate that part of his plan, go to Washington, D.C. himself, and then get Black Power organizations to stay in place. And there were Black Power organizations in all of the large cities. So his plan then became, when he did a demonstration in Washington, then all of the other Black Power groups could do demonstrations in their cities at the same time. And that would give a picture of more power, because that would be like 16 different demonstrations at the same time, somewhat like Black Lives Matter now. And so that was what impressed him. And the guys that Pritchard and JB, they didn't know anything about any of this. So they met a guy that was involved with the invaders, Willie Wine, and he was telling them the story. So that's what made them want to tell the story of the invaders.
But since the film has come out, it's screened all over the world. And also in its wake, you've started working on this book. Well, you've just finished the book called The 400th. And maybe you could talk a little bit about this, especially in the context of like decolonizing histories and like identifying leadership.
That. Well, the easiest way to get into this is presently I'm looking at the world from what I call the new normal. We approached 2020 looking at the world totally different. But once COVID-19, the pandemic hit the world, everything changed. So for me, we will never go back to that world. That world is dead. People have experienced so much, especially the lockdown aspect of it. People have had to look back at that world, what they were doing. And this is because nobody knows whether or not they're going to survive this. So you have, when you're in a position like that, you have to look at the now. And anything that comes out of this world will be the new normal. Now, the 400 is a family narrative. My great-grandfather was the last slave in my family. His son, Burl Lee, which is my great-great-grandfather's name was Burl Lee. He was the first Lee. His son, Burl Lee Jr., was the first freeborn Lee. And so in telling that story, I wanted to help people understand why it is that the way people look at slavery is so foreign from how it actually happened. And so I start the 400 in the Dark Age. The reason I start with the Dark Age is because in order to understand the world that slavery created, you must understand the world that existed before slavery. So you look at Europe. Europe during the Dark Age was poor, dirt poor, okay? And the change that really comes to Europe comes because of the revenue slavery produced. I'll give you an example. They on Facebook, they were running this series where they're talking about the French Revolution before and after the rise of Napoleon. And these series don't mention slavery anywhere. It's like slavery never really happened. But the way I approach the subject is slavery is what all that was about. It produced the revenue for France to create the opulent lifestyles that they live. It produced the revenue for Great Britain to rise up from being the poor country it was. And the significance of it is that all of these changes were the result of trying to control the transatlantic slave trade. That's where France got the revenue to create the opulent lifestyle that they live. Slave revenue was different in Great Britain because what Great Britain did with its revenue was it built the Royal Navy. The reason it built the Royal Navy was it had to fight pirates off of trying to, take the slave ships and take the slave population. So by building the Royal Navy to defend the slave trade, it also used its revenue to do something that most people don't talk about. It created the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is what made the difference between France and Great Britain going forward. Because these wars, that the Napoleonic Wars, they were over control of the slave trade. When I was studying history in school, I could never understand why these guys keep fighting all these wars. I mean, do they just hate each other or what? But when you look at slavery, then you see the revenue that it was produced, it changed Europe completely. So Napoleon, that's what he saw. And his whole effort was to get control of the slave trade so France could dominate it. And Great Britain, on the other hand, was trying to do the same thing. The difference is what Great Britain did with its revenue and what France did with its revenue. So the idea that I'm talking about is slavery was a new normal. The old normal that was there before slavery, the new normal that came after slavery created the Europe that we know now. It produced the revenue that these castles people walk around and travel to see. That all came from slavery. So my effort was to get to my grandfather, great-great-grandfather. So I have to follow the trail of slavery, he was born in 1850, somewhere in the 1850s. We don't know exactly where because he didn't know his parents. And so, but his son, which I knew, as a child up until I was 11. And he would tell me stories about his life and his father's life and the impact of slavery and what they did. So I tell the story of slavery to get to me. And once I get to me, I tell the story to get to hip hop, because the name of the book is The 400, From Slavery to Hip Hop. And the significance of hip hop, which most people don't think about, is that hip hop is the highest form of art development in the Black community. When you look back at art development, you are also looking at the entertainment industry's development in America. The entertainment industry in America developed from slaves. I know that sounds strange, but when you look at slavery, blackface, Lisa, came from white guys coming down south, watching slaves entertain master. Master would have slave buyers and all kind of, when he had his parties and he wanted to entertain, he would get the slaves to entertain. And so these guys saw slaves and they went back up north because they saw how interested people were watching. And so they started imitating slaves. That's why the black face, they had to put charcoal on their face. They dressed in rags like slaves, and they tried their best to imitate the dance, to sing the song. And this is the beginning of the American entertainment industry. The industry grew because in America, prior to that, European entertainment is what white people watch. You got the symphony, you got the ballet, and all of that. So once minstrelsy happened, American entertainment begins to develop. And one of the parts of that is the blues. That's the only American creation of music. Okay, so from blues and minstrelsy, you have the development of American entertainment going forward. And the importance of telling that story is that all of that leads to hip hop.
John, I just want to give you 2 more minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&As.
Okay. All right. One thing I'd like to interject at this point. Coming out of slavery, slaves made 8 important decisions. The first was making families and building community. The next was getting education and communication. The third was entrepreneurship and entertainment. The last was political and cultural development. These 4 things are what the 400 traces, how they started, how they developed, and how they came together to make the history that Black people have. And it all comes to a head in hip hop.
Thanks, John, for sharing. I'm really excited to read the 400th in its entirety, too. Okay, you guys, thank you so much for presenting and being here. And I would love to open this up so we can ask each other questions. I'll let anybody else start first. I don't want to dominate, so. Yes, Arnold.
This is a question for either Mattie or John or both, because it's so rare for me to meet other cultural workers like you. I mean, I'm part of an organization here in Chicago called Three Walls, which I'd love to talk about. It's an arts organization. We have a majority Black board, which is a big change from the way this organization was when it started 17 years ago, with the mission of giving direct support to artists, and still going strong, but all of the staff are Black. The majority of the board are people of color. It's a really special organization.
Great.
And I feel like I couldn't do what I do as an artist and an educator as being part of this. But Mattie also talked about a personal and spiritual drive to do this work. And my real question is, like, sustainability. How do we keep, I mean, it's a struggle. I feel like I'm constantly in fight or flight, you know, and how do I maintain the struggle? I just, you know, I don't see a vacation happening. So and especially John, you've been doing it for so long. Like, how do we maintain our health? How do we maintain joy when we are always in fight or flight, when we are fighting for power? We're fighting racist power.
Well, John, you want to go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take it. My first thought is that I feel like fight or flight is our trauma response, but in this moment, what you're talking about, I don't see a break, you know, quote unquote. We are responding that way under hypercapitalism, and hypercapitalism is an inherently racist, white supremacist structure. And so there's this group that it's like kind of an artistic performative group called Black Power Naps. Sorry, my voice is right. And I think, you know, how do we? I mean, I think, you know, as Black folk, we always are working probably 10 times the amount of other people, because, you know, to walk down the street, we don't know what's going to come at us. And me sitting still is a violence to someone else under white supremacy at times. So I think we need to take that power back in a certain sense. And remember, like, if my presence is so threatening to you, that means I must be some kind of powerful, actually. And so, yeah, I mean, how do we get out of fight or flight? Maybe remember that, you know, we're powerful and we're worthy, and also we're allowed to rest. And rest is revolution.
Yes.
And because we've been working, you know what I mean? And also I think there's the other thing. I think this year, someone asked me recently, well, I've been reflecting about this year, and one of the reflections of this year in conversation was kind of this year has not only asked, but demanded honesty, I think, of all of us. And, you know, across the board. And that's why we're seeing, like, you know, countries crumble, you know, marriages breaking up, like, you know, all kinds of things are going down because it's causing a serious pause. It's a moment of very serious and intentional pause that none of us intended to really take. You know what I mean? But then, you know, so also, like, I think so many people we're in this constant wheelhouse, the hamster wheel, you know, post-industrial revolution, pre-industrial revolution, to tap into what you were talking about, John. You know, we're meant to keep working. They don't want us to stop working. But as the worker, you have to remember, and also once we bring the work back to ourselves, because I was having this conversation with a friend last night, I can't show up for you unless I show up. I can't show up as my best self for you unless I show up for myself first, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so I can't love you until I love myself first in my greatest way, you know? And so, like, if I'm tired, I'm not going to give you my 100%. And I like to work at 100%. So I need to know, and the world asks me of 100%, you know, and I'd like to give it that honor. The work that I choose to engage, I'd like to give it that. So when we remember that, we also must remember, okay, if I can't show up in my fullest self, then that means I need to, because I'm not going to give you actually what I could give you and what you're requesting of me. So also heed my request, and that I need the time to give you what you also want.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say. Yeah. Snaps to that, man. Black Power
Like-
now. I love that phrase when I heard that.
I like to bridge the conversation in that the idea of the new normal to me is to move away from all of the encumbrances that we bring to the subject as descendants of American slavery. We have been educated to respond to our situation today based on how we have always responded to it. One of the things I do in the 400, and the reason when I get to hip hop, its importance is that regardless of what you think about the artists in hip hop is the world's international culture. That is a culture that we created as a people. We don't control it, but we created it. It's the same with entertainment. Black people created American entertainment, but we are not in control of it. So in doing the 400, I wanted to think of a way to bring these ideas forward. And I decided not to try and base what I'm doing in the political arena because I've been a part of the political arena since 1967. And politicians talk. They will talk you to death. And nothing will come out of it. So I decided to base the 400. What's significant about that number? This is the 400. 1619 is the year that historians tend to say that's the first African slaves began coming to America, okay? Which means 2020 is really the 400th year that we've been here. And because of that, we should be really into that idea. We should be looking at that idea and using that idea to create the new normal because we had 400 years. And so my idea was to base it in the arts community. Why? Because artists do things. They are constantly creating. And so I wanted to be able, once I explained hip hop and how it developed and, and all of that, I proposed the 400 performance period. The 400 performance period will run from 2020 to 2030. The reason it will run for 10 years is that we know absolutely nothing about trying to create a performance, a period to where we let our arts be what drives our community. I mean, when I say art, I'm talking about all kinds of creative activity. That would give us the opportunity to learn how to work together on one idea. And what the 400 does is it gets everybody reading the same sentence in the same paragraph, on the same page, in the same chapter, in the same book at the same time. What we have now is everybody has a story of how we got here in their own head. And when you talk to someone about it, they got ideas going and you got ideas going. Anybody on the sideline got ideas going. So what I created is a story that follows the development of those 8 aspects that I gave a moment ago, all the way to today and how we can take the arts, and this is bringing in committees like you're a part of. This is getting museums. The one thing we have never been able to do is put them on the spot. They've always been in position to tell us, like you were saying, about what Black art is, and they compare that to what's in their head about what Black art is supposed to be, what Black art should show. But when you look at most museums, they got the Black arts over in the corner. Like if you go to the Louvre, they got a specific area for Black art, and then they got the Egyptian art over here, and another even large, much an area that's even larger than the whole area they got for Black art. See, we have to challenge that, and we have to have a system that allows us to move from a historical base. We shouldn't be in the position of having to justify our art. It's not about justifying. It's about us expressing who we are, the way we are, and the way we see ourselves. And that's what we should be giving to the world, just like hip hop. We're giving the music, and we're saying, and we're doing, and the world is adopting. Now, that is not the only expression we should have. We should be able to work from within that structure and put ballet, because hey, Misty Copeland is the best the world has right now. But look at all these other little Black girls that's trying to do what she did without access. And that's my idea for the 400 performance period. It's about the kids. It's not about the artists already. It's about the artists 20 years from now. And that's why you need 10 years. See? Because they have to develop their art. They have to start, and there are lots of little, you see, our children are so beautiful, they are so talented, and they want to be out there in the spotlight, but there's no access for them. And this is what I see the 400 performance period doing, is creating access. Artists like you guys need to have the ability to work with the kids.
Yes.
And these art institutions, and they're the ones that should pay for that. Why? Because they're going to get the advantage of the art that they produce. Broadway, all of them. Right now, they getting the cream of the crop off the top because we're trying so hard to break through. But they're not investing in the kids down here that's going to get there one day. So that is what I see as a way to get around fight or flight. See, we have the talent, we have the ability, we have the expertise. You got corporate structures, right? Everybody's talking about how they can put 500 million here or 300 million there, but it has no structure. It has no way of making sure that that money goes past somebody's pocket and get down to where it's really needed to grow the arts community. And that's what we will be doing. We will be growing the arts community from the seeds that 20 years from now, they're going to be a Misty Copeland.
Yes, I love this.
I think it's really important to, train the next generation, from curators and museum directors down to artists. I really agree with that. There's actually a program at the Martin Luther King Elementary School in Portland, Oregon, where these very interesting artists have created the museum. What's it called? The KS MoCA, King School Museum of Contemporary Art. in a public school where
So
they're
good.
bringing artists like me, and I did this last year, to come work with inner city youth. I mean, I think I worked with students from like kindergarten through 6th grade, and mostly Black students.
That's amazing.
And I did a workshop with them, and then we exhibited their work alongside my professional work. They did a catalog with an essay. It's a really beautiful project. It's called KS MoCA. They probably have a website. It's something that you all might want to look at.
They definitely do. I've seen it, and they do stunning work, and I can send a link to everybody too.
Yeah.
Well, you guys, I think that it's about time for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for giving your time and your energy and your wisdom and your creativity, and to not just this, but into my world and into everybody's world. I'm so happy and grateful to see you all.
Well, I thank you for bringing me into it.
John, I'm so happy you made it, man. I was worried about you for a minute.
I wasn't gonna give up.
I know. He's a fighter,
I
this
was
guy.
gonna say, hey, fight or flight. This was fight. I had to get into this as quickly as possible.
Fought for that Zoom.
And I definitely want to stay in touch with everybody. The 400, I'm looking for it to be on the, it should have been on the market, but COVID-19 has slowed everything up. So I'm hoping in the next week or two, we'll hit the market. It'll be on all the major platforms, Barnes and Nobles, Amazon, Kindle, you know, so it won't, I'm going to send around a notice to let everybody know when it's actually on the market.
Exciting. And I'll send a follow-up email with all of you very soon. And I really hope you guys do keep in touch. And thanks again.
We'd all like to meet with you in Brighton
Yeah.
soon.
Yes, we're
Yeah.
gonna do this reunion 2021.
We can have fish and chips on Friday.
As soon as
Yay!
this COVID is over, where we can start to actually get around and bring people together, that's a date. I'm going to hold you to that.
Hold me to it. We would, Percy, we would love to have you.
Yes.
We've definitely had that conversation a lot at the gallery about how much we all love all of you and would love to host you. So
Blessings.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
Yeah.
awesome. Well, let's all stay in touch.
Yes,
Arnold,
please.
Thank you, Stephanie.
we need some chatting to do, Arnold.
Yeah.
Will you send me your show? Well, not, will you shoot a quick note to your show that's in the cities? Maybe
Yes,
I
I'll
can.
forward it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Otherwise, have a great Sunday, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody.
Take that.